The Vatican was completely silent at 3 in the morning. Not the ceremonial silence that fills St. Peter's Basilica during Mass. Not the reverent quiet that settles over a papal audience. This was a different kind of silence. The kind that belongs only to the hours before dawn, when even the oldest stones seem to hold their breath. Pope Leo XIV could not sleep. It had become a pattern in the early weeks of his pontificate. Lying awake in the apostolic palace, feeling the full weight of what he had inherited pressing down on him in the darkness. The decisions, the letters, the faces of the faithful from his first audiences, still vivid behind his eyes when he closed them. He had spent years as a prior general, as a bishop in Chiclayo, as a prefect of a major Vatican dicastery. He thought he knew the church in its entirety. That morning, he was about to discover he had never really seen it at all. He rose quietly, pulled on a simple black cassock, and did what he sometimes did when sleep refused to come. He walked. No security detail, no private secretary, just a man moving through corridors that had witnessed 500 years of church history. He turned toward the oldest administrative wing of the complex, past doors that only cardinals normally opened, through a passage that connected the palace to the older service halls. And that is when he heard it. The soft, rhythmic sound of a mop against marble. He stopped. He turned toward the sound, and what he found in that corridor would set in motion a moment that Catholic observers would later call one of the most quietly historic acts of his entire pontificate. Before we go any further, if you believe the most powerful moments in church history don't always happen in grand ceremonies, but in narrow corridors before sunrise, please consider subscribing to this channel. We exist to bring you stories like this one. Stories that remind the world that God is still moving, often in the humblest of places. Your support helps us reach more people who need to hear them. Now, back to the story. To understand why this moment mattered, you first need to understand something about the Vatican that is almost never discussed publicly. Every single morning, before the first cardinal arrives for his appointments, before the Swiss Guard completes its formal rotation at the bronze door, before the first pilgrim sets foot on the cobblestones of St. Peter's Square, a silent workforce moves through the Vatican, through its hallways, its chapels, its galleries, its offices. They clean the floors on which popes walk. They polish the brass fixtures on doors that open for presidents and kings. They wash the windows that frame the most recognized skyline in the Christian world. They empty the waste bins in offices where decisions affecting 1.4 billion Catholics are debated and made. Most of them arrive before 3 in the morning. Most of them are gone before the institutional day officially begins. Many have worked inside the Vatican for decades, and many, if you ask them honestly, would tell you the same thing. Almost no one notices them, not out of malice, not out of contempt, but because invisibility, in institutions of power, tends to accumulate on its own. No one decides it should happen. It simply does. The Vatican's cleaning and maintenance staff is composed largely of migrant workers, men and women from the Philippines, from Peru, from Sri Lanka, from Nigeria, from Romania and Poland and Ecuador. They are, without exception, people of deep faith. They cross themselves when they enter the Sistine Chapel carrying their mops and buckets. They whisper Hail Marys while scrubbing the marble floors beneath Michelangelo's ceiling. They are, in every meaningful sense, among the most quietly devoted people inside those ancient walls. And yet, their employment contracts had not been formally reviewed in nearly 11 years. And yet there was no official mechanism by which they could raise a concern and expect it to be heard. And yet the overwhelming majority of the Church's senior administrative leadership could not have told you the first name of a single person on that staff. Pope Leo XIV knew none of this when he turned a corner in the pre-dawn darkness. He was simply a man who could not sleep. Her name was Maricel. She was 61 years old, small and unhurried in her movements, with the particular efficiency of someone who has done the same work for so long that it has become a kind of muscle memory. She had come to Rome from the Philippines 23 years earlier, following her husband, who had found work as a Vatican maintenance worker. When he died suddenly of a cardiac event, 8 years into their life in Rome, Maricel had stayed. Italy had no one for her. But the Vatican, these corridors, these chapels, this strange and ancient city within a city, had somehow become the only place she knew how to be. Her children were grown and scattered across 3 continents. She went to Mass every morning before her shift began, in a small church 3 blocks from her apartment, and then walked to work in the dark. She was washing the floor of a narrow gallery connecting 2 administrative wings when she became aware that someone was standing behind her. She turned, startled, and found herself face to face with a tall man in a simple black cassock, watching her with an expression she could not immediately read. It took her several seconds to understand who she was looking at. When she did, her hand went involuntarily to her mouth. She began to step aside, to bow, to apologize for being in his path, but he stopped her with a quiet, unhurried gesture of his hand. "Please," he said gently, in careful Italian, "don't stop on my account." She stood frozen, uncertain what the protocol was for this. There was no protocol. Popes did not wander alone through service corridors at 3 in the morning. This was not something her 2 decades of experience had prepared her for. But he crossed the gallery and sat down on a plain wooden bench along the wall. He folded his hands. He looked at her with the attentiveness of a man who genuinely wanted to know something. "How long have you worked here?" he asked. She told him, 23 years. He nodded slowly, as though he were doing arithmetic that meant something to him. "And what is it like," he said, "working here in these hours, when the building belongs to no one but you?" She wasn't sure whether she should answer. For 23 years, senior Vatican officials had passed her in these corridors without acknowledgement, not cruelly, simply as a habit of vision, the way you stop registering the furniture in a room you use every day. And now the Bishop of Rome was sitting on a bench, asking her what her working hours felt like. She decided, almost without deliberating, to tell the truth. She told him about the Sistine Chapel. She told him that every single morning, before she began cleaning, she stood for a moment in the center of that room and looked up. Every morning for 23 years, the same ceiling, the same light, depending on the hour, the same slow burn of awe she had never been able to fully explain to anyone who asked. She had watched tour groups come through on permitted mornings, wealthy visitors, academics, diplomats, all of them craning their necks, all of them gasping at Michelangelo. And she had thought to herself many times, in her quiet way, "I am the one who keeps this floor clean so they can stand here and look up. They don't think about that, but I think about it every time I see them." She wasn't saying it as a complaint. She said it the way a person states a fact they have learned to carry with a certain peace. Pope Leo XIV looked at her for a long, still moment. Then he asked the question that would change the course of the weeks ahead. "Are there others working here right now?" There were 47 others. Over the next 90 minutes, Pope Leo XIV walked through the Vatican, through service corridors and back hallways, through the outer chapels and administrative wings, through rooms that tourists never enter and that cardinals pass through without looking, and he found them. One by one, he did not announce himself with ceremony. He had no photographer, no press secretary, no assistant taking notes on his behalf. He carried only the pen and small notebook he habitually kept in his cassock pocket for middle-of-the-night thoughts. He asked every person the same 3 questions. "How long have you worked here? What is it like? What do you need?" What he found was not a scandal in the way scandals are usually defined. There were no crimes, no deliberate acts of cruelty, no single administrator to hold responsible for a specific wrong. What he found was something more diffuse and, in its own way, more difficult to address. A system of institutional invisibility so complete, so normalized, and so long-standing that it had become its own form of injustice. He found a woman who had worked in the Vatican for 31 years and had never once been addressed by name by any official whose offices she maintained. He found a man from Sri Lanka who cleaned the corridors of a major Vatican dicastery every morning and had not, in 16 years, been asked by anyone how he was doing. He found a young Peruvian woman who had been employed there for 3 years and genuinely did not know that she was entitled to sick leave because no one had ever explained her contract to her in a language she fully understood. He found people who prayed while they worked, people who took deep and unperformed pride in the sacred spaces they maintained, people who had given the most active decades of their lives to this institution, people the institution had simply forgotten to see. When the first cardinal arrived for his morning appointments, Pope Leo XIV had already returned to his study. He sat at his desk. He did not open the day's correspondence. He did not call for his secretary. He sat in silence for a long time, holding the notebook in which he had written 48 names. Then he picked up his pen and began to write something else entirely. Have you ever been part of an institution, a parish, a school, a workplace where certain people simply weren't seen, where someone faithful and hard-working remained invisible, not because anyone chose it, but because the system had never developed the habit of looking? Leave a comment below, because what Pope Leo XIV did next suggests that one person deciding to truly look can change far more than anyone expects. What he wrote was not a formal document, not an encyclical, not an apostolic letter, not a curial instruction. It was a personal letter, handwritten, on plain Vatican stationery, addressed to every member of the Vatican's sanitation and maintenance staff. He instructed his personal secretary to ensure that every person received a copy, in their own language. The letter had 3 distinct parts. In the first, he described what he had witnessed that morning, not in vague, institutional language, but specifically. He mentioned Maricel by name. He mentioned the man from Sri Lanka and the length of his service. He mentioned the young woman from Peru who didn't know she had sick leave. The names were there. The years of service were there. He had used his notebook. And the specificity of it, the proof that he had listened carefully enough to remember, struck many who received the letter harder than anything else in it. In the second part, he said something that the Vatican's press office would later describe, in its measured official language, as an expression of institutional contrition. In ordinary human terms, it was an apology. He wrote that the Church, which proclaims the dignity of every human person as a cornerstone of its social teaching, had failed to consistently live that truth within its own administrative walls. He did not say this as an abstraction. He said, "We have failed you specifically, you, who clean our chapels before we enter them, you, who make it possible for us to present a face of beauty and order to the world. We have not seen you the way Christ sees you. And for that, I am sorry." The third section of the letter was not rhetorical at all. It contained a list of concrete commitments. Every cleaning and maintenance worker in the Vatican would receive a formal review of their employment contract within 60 days, conducted with a certified translator present in their primary language. A formal, confidential channel would be established for workers to raise concerns and receive a documented response. Every incoming senior Vatican official would be required as part of their orientation to spend one morning working alongside the sanitation staff. Not as a media event, not as a symbolic gesture to be photographed, as a private act of formation, required and unannounced. And once a year, Pope Leo XIV himself committed to hosting a private breakfast. No cameras, no press, no ceremony for the people who cleaned the Vatican. The letter was distributed on a Tuesday. By Thursday, word had quietly reached the Vatican press corps through sources they would not name. By Friday, it was on the front pages of Catholic newspapers across 4 continents. And then something happened that no one inside the Vatican had anticipated. The story broke internationally, not through an official Vatican press release, none had been issued, but because of a photograph. Maricel's daughter, living in Manila, received a message from her mother on a Tuesday evening. Attached was an image, the handwritten letter, held up in her mother's 2 hands, slightly blurred at the edges where her fingers caught the frame. Below the image, her mother had written a single line. "The Pope knows my name." Her daughter posted it. Within 48 hours, it had been seen by millions of people across dozens of countries. But what transformed the moment from a moving human story into something with genuine historical weight was what happened the following Sunday. Pope Leo XIV was scheduled to deliver his regular Angelus address from the window of the Apostolic Palace, looking down at the thousands of pilgrims gathered in St. Peter's Square. These addresses follow a familiar rhythm, a brief reflection on the Sunday Gospel, a few prayer intentions, a blessing, and the traditional Marian prayer. The crowds know what to expect. The television crews know their angles. That Sunday, after his reflection on the Gospel of Mark, the Pope set aside his prepared text. He looked out over the square, the upturned faces, the raised phones, the families with children on their shoulders, the pilgrims who had come from 60 countries to stand in that place. And he said something that no modern pope had said from that window. He said that earlier in the week he had met the people who truly keep the Vatican running. Not the cardinals, Not the dicastery heads, not the secretaries of state, not the theologians. He was talking about the men and women who come before the sun rises and leave before the institutional day begins. The ones who make it possible for everyone else to walk into clean, beautiful, well-ordered spaces and do their work. He told the square about a woman named Maricel, who had cleaned the Vatican's floors for 23 years and who stood every single morning in the Sistine Chapel and looked up at the ceiling before she lifted her mop. A woman who understood, in her bones, what it meant to serve a sacred space. He said, "She understands something about beauty, humility, and faithful service that I am still learning. She is, in a very real sense, my teacher." And then, in front of thousands of witnesses and the cameras that carry the Angelus to the world, Pope Leo XIV said, with complete clarity and without qualification, "I apologize. On behalf of this institution, I apologize to every person who has served these walls faithfully and without recognition. You are not invisible to God. You should never have been invisible to us." The square fell into a silence that lasted several full seconds. And then, it was not silent at all. In the weeks that followed, the commitments in the Pope's letter began to take shape. The contract reviews were completed inside the promised 60-day window. Translators were brought in. Several workers, many of whom had never sat across a table from anyone in Vatican administration for any purpose, emerged from those meetings having learned, for the first time, the full scope of their entitlements. 3 workers who raised concerns through the new confidential channel had those concerns formally acknowledged and addressed. One involved a scheduling arrangement that had been quietly endured for over 4 years. It was resolved in a single meeting. Another involved a breakroom request that had been submitted multiple times across 7 years and lost in successive administrative transitions. It was granted within 2 weeks. Maricel attended the first annual breakfast. She sat at a table with 7 colleagues and the Pope of the Catholic Church in a private dining room, with no cameras and no official agenda. She later told her daughter that they talked about food from home, about what each of them missed, about children, about the particular quality of the light in Rome in early spring, about faith. She said, "He asked about your uncle. I had mentioned him the night we met in the corridor. He had written it down. He remembered." For Maricel, that detail mattered more than the Sunday address heard around the world. More than the front pages, more than the millions of people who had seen her photograph. It was not the scale of the gesture that moved her. It was its precision, the proof that she had been genuinely heard and not simply witnessed. The episode did not remain inside the Vatican walls. Bishops wrote to the Holy See from Southeast Asia, from Latin America, from Sub-Saharan Africa, saying the story had prompted them to conduct similar reviews in their own diocesan offices. A religious order in Brazil introduced a required month of unannounced manual service into the first year of novitiate formation, framed not as humiliation, not as penance, but as encounter. A cardinal in the Philippines quietly held his own version of the annual breakfast for the domestic staff of his residence 4 months after the Vatican story broke. What had begun with one man who could not sleep, turning a corner he had never turned before, was moving slowly, imperfectly, but really through the living body of the Church. There is a moment in the Gospel of Mark that has long been considered one of the most humanly vivid scenes in the entire New Testament. Jesus is moving through a crowd so dense that his disciples can barely keep pace with him. Someone in that crowd reaches out and touches the hem of his garment. The disciples are baffled by what happens next. "Teacher," they say, "the whole crowd is pressing against you on every side. How can you possibly ask who touched you?" But Jesus stops. He waits. He looks, because for him, there is no such thing as an anonymous contact. There is no touch too small to merit his full attention. There is no person too peripheral, too overlooked, too easily passed, to be deserving of his complete regard. What Pope Leo XIV did in those pre-dawn corridors was, in its essential character, a reflection of that same gospel instinct. He did not go down into those service halls as a reformer with an agenda. He went because he could not sleep, and walking helped him think. He stayed because he had the particular gift of people who genuinely listen, the ability to receive what another person is actually saying, rather than the version of it that fits neatly into what you already believe. And in listening, he found what the Church has always known in principle and must always fight, in every generation, to practice. That the dignity of the human person is not a theological abstraction written in documents. It is a specific face, in a specific corridor, with a specific name, and a 23-year history of faithful early morning service. The Catholic social tradition speaks of what theologians call a preferential option for the poor, the Church's particular obligation to direct its attention toward those the world has trained itself not to see. Scholars write about it in careful, precise language. Bishops cite it in pastoral letters. Papal documents affirm it with solemn authority. And sometimes, in the quiet hours before sunrise, a pope in a plain black cassock turns a corner he has never turned before and lives it. The lesson here is not that institutions are irreparably corrupt, or that a single conversation can substitute for systemic change. The lesson is harder and more demanding than that. The lesson is that truly seeing another person by name, with patience, with the full weight of attention you would give to someone who obviously matters, is itself an act of holiness. And that the failure to see, however unintentional, however the product of habit and busyness and institutional routine, is a genuine moral failure, not a small one. Maricel did not need a papal apology to know her own worth. She had known it every morning for 23 years, standing in the Sistine Chapel before she began her work, looking up at the image of God reaching toward Adam across the expanse of a ceiling that she had made clean. She had always known what that meant, but the apology was not only for her. Perhaps it was for every person inside those walls who had learned, over the years, to walk past without stopping, to look without seeing, to accept invisibility as simply the way things are in large institutions, as though it were a feature of nature rather than a choice. The apology became historic not because of its drama, and not only because of its scale. It became historic because it was specific, because it named names, because it was followed, within weeks, by concrete and verifiable action, and because it came from a man who, in the middle of a sleepless night, had wandered out of his rooms and discovered that the kingdom of God was already present in a corridor that smelled of cleaning fluid. It had been present there for 23 years. He had simply never walked down that corridor before. Now he had, and he had written down every name. If this story touched something in you, if it reminded you that every act of humble, faithful service carries weight before God, and that being truly seen by another human being is among the most profound gifts one person can give another, then please share this video with someone who needs to hear it today. Subscribe to the channel so you never miss a story like this one. Like the video to help more people find it, and leave a comment below. Who is the Maricel in your world? Who is the person in your parish, your workplace, your family, who shows up faithfully, day after day, and is rarely acknowledged? Tell us their name if you can. Honor them here, and tell us where in the world you are watching from, because every name matters, just as Maricel always knew hers did.